This is the 1.6 version of the Eljer Auburn toilet, one of the last ever made, introduced in the early 1990s and made up until circa 2001. The Eljer Auburn has had a very interesting trend when it comes to generations. First generation was basically a straight down flushing toilet. The second generation was kind of like the Eljer Sanus in a way, except a lot less good in terms of quality. The third generation was the 3.5 version, which was actually pretty good. And this is the 1.6 gallon version, the final one ever made of the Auburn series. This is probably the most pathetic send-off I have ever seen. I sometimes argue if this is even worse than other toilets like the 1.6 gallon Color Kingston. And today, we'll be taking a look at this absolute joke. For starters, the base is the exact same as a 3.5 version. It looks exactly the same on the outside. The inside is where it looks a bit different. So as we go inside the trapway opening, notice that it has the same look as a 3.5. Almost. Notice how sometimes these are a little bit smaller in terms of size when it comes to the opening. And another major difference you might see is the siphon jet. The older ones have a weird looking siphon jet down the middle, while this one is a little bit smaller and pointed upward. And down here you really can't see it, but there's actually angled down jets and a stream of jets towards the front here. The reason being is that this is actually a blowout. The fact that this is blowout is a bit weird considering that generally most blowout toilets are free bullets. As you can see here, this is one of the very few, if any at all, that have 4 bullet setup, which is quite interesting. Honestly, the blowout direction of this Auburn is a weird way to take the Auburn series, considering it's always been a siphonic toilet. Meanwhile, this one's blowout, which is very unusual. Now let's have a look at a flush. On a certain pressure, the flush can be quite interesting, albeit not very special. Not only that, these things can be very loud, as you may have heard. Alright, now it's time to dig into this toilet. This thing absolutely sucks at everything. For starters, one of the major problems this generation has is its constant shredding. Like, this thing shreds like crazy. It makes the 1.6 gallon Color Kingston blush. It's that terrible with shredding. And it's a very common problem with these, which is honestly ridiculous. While I don't say these things clog easily as some other toilets, the smaller opening also really doesn't help that fact. While it carries over the 3.5 design in some ways, it just isn't implemented well here either. So the performance is not as good as the 3.5. Now let's take a look at ball rings. This is where we get problems. The ball rings here is better implemented than some others I've seen, but I tell you, the ball rings on these are just awful. You may have noticed how slow it is implementing the bolt rings. Like, it only like a few seconds into the cycle before it starts implementing some of its rim jets. Like, you saw how the front rim has a little bit of a leg blowing out and assisting the flush. And unfortunately, these things are known for having little to no ball rings. This one's a better example of ball rings being good, but it's still pretty terrible ball rings. And that is the 1.6 Eljer Auburn toilet. Probably the most pathetic rendition I've ever seen. I mean, this thing's been through some ups and downs in terms of quality, but this is easily the worst. Not even a debate, but let's grade it. The overall design of the 1.6 Gallon Eljer Auburn is very similar to the 3.5 gallon version. And spoiler alert, when I eventually do its review, it's very plain. I don't really have a lot to say about it, and it gets a 5. Let's get this out of the way. The quality control is absolutely horrendous on these. These have very similar problems to the 1.6 gallon Kohler Kingston, which ironically is what this toy is compared to most of the time. The rim jets don't really work all that properly and take a little bit to kick in. Even the front jets take a little bit to kick in. The bulwarks is terrible and it constantly shreds. Dare I say even more so than the 1.6 gallon Kohler Kingston. We'll cover this in its individual categories, but the quality control just does not work with this. It gets a 2. Compared to the 3.5 gallon version, the consistency is a little bit down, but that's not saying that it's bad because it's still kind of consistent. I have noticed that some of them do have a little bit of weird deformations, but they're not really that noticeable. But one thing I've noticed is that the openings tend to look a little bit smaller on some compared to others, which is a bit weird, especially considering that the consistency is a little bit better on the 3.5 gallon version. So it's a bit weird, but not bad, I guess. I give it a 7. I mentioned that the trapway is somewhat shorter, or it looks like it, because of the opening. The trapway, I guess, looks to be about the same, maybe slightly modified to fit the blowout flush, but I have noticed that the opening is a little bit smaller compared to the 3.5 gallon versions, which is a bit weird, but I'll give it a 5. At first, the flush looks pretty interesting, but then you gotta consider some key factors. The front jets take a good bit of time to kick in. The flush can be pretty irritating to the ears, very similar to a Kohler high crest. And just everything about it just kind of falls flat. On paper, the flush sounds interesting, but executed in this form, the flush is pretty bad, even for a blowout toilet. I'll give it a 4. The pull is an absolute joke. Like, it's a joke. I've already mentioned a few times already that the front jets seem to take a while to kick in, so sometimes this leads to it shredding a lot more than it needs to. Even on higher pressure, these things shred. Dare I say, these shred a lot more consistently compared to the 1.6 gallon Kohler Kingstons and even the Kohler High Crest. How do you do that? Regardless of what pressure you get this on, it's going to shred pretty frequently. You can quite literally put a toilet seat cover in it, just one, and it still shreds. Pathetic. It gets a 2. I can't really say I've seen these clogged very frequently, because I surprisingly haven't. But disregarding that, the performance on these don't look to be anything to be desired. That is, if it doesn't get shredded, that is. But that's the pull, not the performance. The performance itself gets a 5. But let's be completely real here, it is a far cry from the 3.5 gallon version. Do not let this particular one fool you. The bulwark is awful. Not only do the jets take a while to kick in, but it barely covers anything. I've seen a lot of these with tons of stains on them, even on the front, which is ridiculous. It pretty much has the same issues as the 1.6 gallon Kohler Kingston, and because of that, I'm giving this a 2. It sucks. I've been seeing these less and less, which is good for me, but for the survivability, it's not a good sign. A lot of these are starting to go away, whether it's because they suck or because it has constant problems. I actually recall seeing a 1.6 Auburn last only 4 years before, ironically enough, getting replaced with a Kohler Kingston from the 1.6 gallon era. That is pretty sad. The survivability now is looking like a 4, but I wouldn't be surprised if it increases anytime soon. Let's talk about the value, or what little there is, because this thing is terrible. Everything about it is terrible. The ideal on paper sounds interesting, but when you execute it, why even bother? Everything about this version of the Auburn sucks. The flush is underwhelming for a blowout, the quality control sucks, the ballroom sucks, The pull sucks even on higher pressure. This is ridiculous. It makes you wonder why this was even made to begin with, because there is nothing good about this toilet. Why was this made? I will never know. It gets a 2. The final score of the 1.6 gallon version of the Eljer Auburn toilet is a 38 out of 100. There is no question, this is the worst version of the Eljer Auburn ever made. It literally takes an interesting idea and just executes it out in the worst way possible. I honestly don't know how this was so awful. I really don't, because at first it sounds very interesting, but then you look at the finished product and it's just a mess. An absolute disaster of a mess. It makes you wonder what a good version looks like. But this is far from it.